It was 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Ridgerest Memorial Hospital was running on skeleton staff, fluorescent silence, and the slow mechanical breathing of machines that never slept. Most of the day's shift had gone home. The parking lot was half empty. Somewhere down the east corridor, a television in a patient's room murmured the late news. Everything was calm. Everything was
Vitals are
ordinary.
stable, moving to
And then the call
transport.
came. Room
Copy.
412.
Airway clear, loading
Cardiac
now.
event. Male
Watch the
patient,
debris. Keep it
62
steady.
years old,
Patients
post-surgery.
secured, moving out.
The monitors screamed. The numbers collapsed. 2 nurses rushed through the double doors. A resident was paged. The crash cart clattered down the hallway. But the woman who was already standing at his bedside, the one who had been standing there for 4 minutes before the monitors ever went off, no one asked how she knew. Her name badge said Elena M., night nurse. Floor 4. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't running. She was completely, almost disturbingly calm, her gloved hands moving with a precision that felt less like nursing and more like something else entirely. Something trained. Something automatic. She had already adjusted the oxygen. She had already started a second line. She had already noted the rhythm change in his breathing 20 minutes earlier and had quietly moved the crash cart from the supply alcove to just outside his door before anyone on staff had noticed a thing. The resident arrived. Young, disheveled, slightly panicked. He took one look at the room and started giving orders to everyone except her. Dr. Harmon, who authorized the second-floor line. Get the charge nurse in here. Who is even managing this patient right now? Elena stepped back. She didn't argue. She didn't explain herself. She just moved to the corner of the room, folded her hands, and watched, the way a chess player watches a board they've already solved. The patient stabilized. The crisis passed. The resident exhaled, straightened his coat, and began writing notes like the whole thing had been his doing. Elena quietly removed her gloves, dropped them in the waste bin, checked the saline drip one more time, and walked out of the room without a single word. No one said thank you. No one even looked up. Down the hall, near the nurse's station, the charge nurse, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Greer, stood watching with her arms crossed. She had seen the whole thing from the doorway. She had seen Elena at the bedside before the alarm. She had seen the prepositioned crash cart. She didn't say anything either, but something behind her eyes shifted. Not gratitude. Something colder than that. The kind of look someone gives when they realize they don't fully understand another person, and they don't like that feeling one bit. 3 days later, Elena Marchetti was called into the hospital administrator's office and handed a termination letter. Unsanctioned medical interventions. Failure to follow protocol. Pattern of acting outside defined nursing scope. She read it once. Set it on the desk. Didn't cry. Didn't argue. Just asked for a copy for her records and walked out of Ridgerest Memorial for the last time. Nobody at that hospital knew who she really was. Nobody knew what she had left behind to be there. And nobody, not one single person, knew what was coming for her at midnight, 11 days later. Elena Marchetti was 38 years old and easy to underestimate. That was, perhaps, by design. She was average height. With dark hair, she kept pulled back in a practical bun and hands that were always steady. Not the kind of steady that comes from confidence, but the deeper kind that comes from having held them still through things that would have made other people shake for years. She rented a small apartment 12 minutes from the hospital, drove a used Subaru, kept to herself. The other nurses knew almost nothing about her. She had worked at Ridgerest for 7 months, long enough to be trusted with the night shift, not long enough to be considered part of the inner circle that forms in every hospital like a second organism, breathing gossip and hierarchy. She ate lunch alone, usually in the stairwell. She never complained about her assignments. She once worked a 14-hour shift without sitting down and never mentioned it. She brought a single plant to her locker, a succulent, barely alive, sitting in a cracked plastic pot, and watered it every Tuesday with exactly half a cup of water from the break room sink. Small details that seemed unremarkable, unless you knew what to look for. Her apartment, for instance. The other nurses imagined it like their own, full of throw pillows and Netflix and half-finished bottles of wine. But Elena's apartment was different. Spare. Almost military in its precision. Her closet was organized by function, not color. Her shoes were lined up heel to heel. In her kitchen cabinet, directly above the coffee maker, sat a small first aid kit. Not a drugstore kit, but a real one. The kind with a tourniquet and a chest seal and a package of quick clot gauze. In her bedside drawer, beneath a worn paperback and a charging cable, was a folded piece of paper. A commendation letter. She never framed it. She never showed it to anyone. The corners were soft from folding and refolding. The way a person handles something they've read so many times the words have gone quiet. At the hospital, she had a reputation for being eerily calm in emergencies. Not the performed calm of someone forcing themselves to breathe slowly, but a real, bone-deep stillness that other nurses found slightly unnerving. There was a moment, 3 months into her tenure, when a patient had gone into sudden respiratory distress during her rounds. The attending hadn't been reached. The charge nurse was on break. Elena had managed the situation alone for 6 minutes, and when the attending finally arrived and reviewed the notes, he'd gone quiet for a moment before saying, very carefully, "This documentation is unusually precise." She had simply nodded and moved on to her next patient. Coworker, Joanna. Where did you train? You don't talk like someone who just came from a 2-year program. Elena. I've had a lot of experience. She never said more than that. But there were clues for anyone paying close enough attention. The way she scanned a room the moment she entered it. Not anxiously, but systematically, like she was assessing for exits and threats and variables. The way she always knew where the nearest defibrillator was. The way she sometimes paused mid-conversation for just a half second. The way soldiers do when they're listening to 2 things at once. There were her hands. She had a small scar on the outer edge of her right wrist, thin and precise, not the kind that comes from an accident. The kind that gets sutured in a field tent at 2 in the morning by someone working by flashlight. Another one along her left collarbone, usually hidden by her scrubs. She wore no jewelry, no rings, but there was a faint tan line on her left wrist, the ghost of a watch worn outdoors in a sunlight too strong for American suburbs. The kind of sunlight you find in certain parts of the world where people don't go for vacation. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody even looked for dots to connect. She was just Elena, the quiet night nurse on floor 4, the one who was good in a crisis, the one who stayed in her lane, the one nobody really knew, the one who had been, until 4 years ago, something none of them could have imagined, and something that was about to catch up with her in the middle of the night, whether she was ready or not. Ridgerest Memorial was not a bad hospital. It was, like most institutions, something more complicated than that, a place shaped by the ambitions and insecurities of the people who ran it, as much as by any mission statement hanging in the lobby. The administrator was a man named Gerald Holloway, 55 years old, with a background in hospital management and a talent for protecting the hospital's rating scores above everything else. He had the energy of someone who had never once been the least important person in a room and deeply intended to keep it that way. Patricia Greer, the night charge nurse, had worked at Ridgerest for 11 years. She knew the rhythms of the place the way an old sailor knows weather, through the bones, not the brain. She was good at her job. She was also deeply territorial. The night floor was hers. The staff was hers. The patients were hers to manage, assign, and oversee. New nurses earned their place slowly, deferentially, by learning to orbit her authority. Elena, from the start, had been a problem. Not because she was difficult, precisely because she wasn't. She never pushed back. She never complained. She just quietly did everything better than everyone expected, without asking for permission or acknowledgement. And that, in a place built on hierarchy, was its own kind of provocation. Competence without deference is its own form of rebellion in certain institutions. The first real incident had come in Elena's 2nd month. A new patient, post-op, floor 3, was showing subtle signs of internal bleeding. The day nurse had noted it and flagged it for the attending. The attending had looked at the chart, said it was within normal post-surgical range, and moved on. Elena, picking up the patient at shift change, had read those same numbers and reached a different conclusion. She had requested a second review. Politely, formally, through the correct channels. The attending had been annoyed. Patricia had been embarrassed on his behalf. The second scan had confirmed a slow internal bleed. The patient had gone back into surgery. He'd survived. The attending had quietly updated his notes and moved on without acknowledging the catch. No one thanked Elena. Patricia had called her into the break room and told her, with careful professional language, that flagging concerns through the hierarchy was important, and going outside the chain of reporting, even with good intentions, created problems for everyone. Elena, the patient would have bled out by morning. Patricia, that's not the point. Elena had looked at her for a long moment. Not angrily, not defiantly. Just with the kind of steady patience that is harder to argue against than any raised voice. And said, very quietly, "Okay." She never stopped watching for what others missed. She never stopped acting on what she found. She just got quieter about it. More invisible. She learned to work around the hierarchy without touching it, the way water finds its path around stone. The younger nurses liked her, though they weren't sure why. She never gossiped. She never played politics. When a new graduate panicked during her first medication error, it was Elena who appeared beside her, said nothing dramatic, and walked her methodically through the correction process. Calm and precise. The way you talk someone through defusing something dangerous. One of those young nurses, a 24-year-old named Danny, asked her once, in the break room at 3 in the morning, over bad coffee and the particular kind of honesty that only comes in the small hours. Were you ever scared? Like, in a real emergency. Were you ever actually scared? Elena had looked at the window. Outside, the parking lot was pooled in sodium light. She was quiet for so long that Danny thought she hadn't heard the question. Elena. Yes. In the beginning. Fear's not the enemy, though. The enemy is letting it make your decisions for you. Danny had nodded like she understood. She didn't, fully, but she remembered it. The month before her firing, the pressure on Elena had increased. Holloway had introduced a new protocol review process. Patricia had used it to document every instance where Elena had acted outside the precise letter of her nursing scope, even when those actions had been clearly beneficial. The documentation was meticulous. The framing was relentless. Elena was not oblivious. She saw the architecture of what was being built around her. She had seen this kind of thing before, in different settings, with different stakes. She knew, with quiet certainty, that it was going to end in one of two ways. Either she would leave on her own terms, or she would be pushed. She chose to stay, not out of stubbornness, out of something else. Something that had to do with a name she hadn't said out loud in 4 years, and a promise she had made to herself when she left the life she used to live. She stayed until the day the letter landed on the desk, and then she walked out of the building and into a silence that, for the first time, felt like waiting. The incidents, when you laid them out in sequence, told a story that no one at Ridgerest was willing to read out loud. The first one most people remembered was the overdose in room 208. It had come in mid-shift, a middle-aged man, brought in from the street by paramedics, unresponsive, vitals deteriorating. The ER had stabilized him and transferred him upstairs. By the time Elena received him, he was conscious but combative. The ER notes listed his presentation as a standard opioid case. Elena had read the notes. Then she had looked at the man, and something in the way she read people, something that had nothing to do with the chart, had made her pause. She had requested an additional tox screen for fentanyl analogs, the kind of request that took 5 minutes to process and that nobody on staff had thought to make. He wasn't on standard opioids. He had taken a synthetic compound that didn't respond to standard naloxone dosing. She knew the difference. More importantly, she knew why she knew the difference. She had adjusted the protocol quietly. The patient survived. The attending later reviewed the case and noted, with visible discomfort, that the standard treatment would have been insufficient. He didn't ask how she had known. She didn't offer to explain. Mini cliffhanger, but someone had noticed. Someone had written it down. The second incident was stranger. A family had been waiting in the third-floor consultation room for news about their father, a man who had come in for what everyone believed was a minor cardiac event. Elena had passed by the room 3 times in an hour. On the third pass, she had stopped, gone inside, sat with them for 4 minutes, saying almost nothing, just present. Then she had gone directly to the attending and said, very quietly, that she believed the patient's condition was more serious than the preliminary read. Dr. Kwan. On what basis? You haven't even been in his room tonight. Elena. I've been watching his family. Kwan had stared at her. That was not a medical answer. That was not a clinical basis for anything. He had dismissed it. 2 hours later, the patient had coded. They had saved him, barely. The post-event review had determined that earlier intervention would have made a significant difference. No one brought up Elena's warning in the review meeting. But Danny had been in the hallway when it happened, and she had never forgotten it. Mini cliffhanger, watching a family, and knowing something from it. What kind of training produces that? There was the time, in month 4, when a man had arrived in the waiting room claiming to be there for a scheduled procedure. Standard intake. Except Elena had walked by the waiting room, glanced at him through the glass, and immediately gone to the security desk and asked them to check his identity against the appointment system. She hadn't been dramatic about it. She had been calm, specific, almost bored about it. The man was not who he claimed to be. He was a patient from the psychiatric unit who had walked out of a different facility 2 towns over. He was in crisis. He was carrying something in his jacket. The situation had been handled quietly, and the incident report had been written in language so neutral it barely registered as serious. But the head of security, a retired police officer named Ridgerest, had found Elena afterward and looked at her with the particular recognition of someone who had spent his career around people trained to sense things others miss. Ramirez. What tipped you off? Elena. He was watching the exits, not the desk. Ramirez had nodded slowly. He hadn't asked anything else. But from that day forward, every time Elena walked into a room where he was standing, he straightened up slightly, the involuntary body language of someone recognizing a rank they haven't been told about. Mini cliffhanger, Ramirez knew. Whatever she had been, he recognized the shape of it, even without a name. By her 6th month, the pattern was undeniable to everyone paying attention, which was fewer people than you might expect, because Ridgerest was a place where paying attention to things that complicated your narrative was its own professional risk. Patricia had her documentation. Holloway had his protocols. The attending physicians had their egos to protect. And together they had constructed an airtight case for getting rid of the one person on the floor who had never once endangered a patient and had, on at least 4 documented occasions, saved one. The week before the firing, Patricia had left a note in Elena's personnel file, marked for administrative review, listing 9 separate instances of scope boundary concerns. Every one of them had resulted in positive patient outcomes. Not one of them had resulted in harm. The note did not mention outcomes. It only mentioned the boundary crossings. They fired her for being too good at keeping people alive. Read that sentence again and let it sit there for a moment. Elena packed her locker in 11 minutes, watered her succulent one last time, handed in her badge, said goodbye to Danny, who was crying in a way Elena was not, walked to her car, sat for a moment in the parking lot silence. Then she drove home, made tea, sat in the dark of her apartment, and waited, though she didn't know yet what she was waiting for. 11 days after Elena Marchetti walked out of Ridgerest Memorial, a bus overturned on Route 9 2 miles from the hospital. It was a charter, 43 passengers. The accident happened at 11:08 p.m., a Friday night. Skeleton staff, 1 trauma surgeon on call, and 2 emergency residents who had each been awake for 19 hours. The ER had not run a mass casualty drill in 7 months. The hospital's disaster protocol binder was on a shelf in Gerald Holloway's office, last reviewed 14 months ago. The first ambulances arrived at 11:22. The ER absorbed the shock like something that hadn't been built for shocks. By 11:35, there were 12 patients in the trauma bay with 4 more in the hallway, 3 more in triage, and a call coming in saying another ambulance was 8 minutes out with a pediatric patient in critical condition. The nurses moved fast. The residents moved faster in their speech and slower in their judgment, the dangerous combination that comes with exhaustion and overwhelm. Controlled chaos. That's what they'd call it later, in the debrief. But it wasn't controlled. Not even close. Patricia Greer was running the floor and doing it badly, not from incompetence, but from a system that had never prepared her for this volume. She was making triage calls without enough information. She had assigned 2 nurses to a patient who was stable and left a deteriorating one unmonitored. She was loud in a way that communicated stress to every person in the room, and stress travels fast in a crisis. The trauma surgeon, Dr. Elaine Park, was in, or 2 with a patient already on the table, a man with internal bleeding who had arrived first and couldn't be abandoned. She was sending orders via intercom and getting relayed back information that was sometimes incomplete and sometimes wrong because the chain between her and the floor was breaking down under pressure. The pediatric patient arrived at 11:43, 8 years old, female, head trauma, possibly spinal involvement, internal bleeding suspected. The paramedics who brought her in were talking over each other. The intake nurse was overwhelmed. The second resident had just been pulled to a different bay and wasn't coming back. The girl's name was Maya, and she was running out of time. Danny, the young nurse who had sat with Elena in the break room, the one who had cried when Elena left, was the one assigned to Maya's bay. She was 24 years old and 11 months into her career, and she was doing everything she could remember from her training, and it was almost enough, but not quite. Her hands were shaking. She was missing things, not from negligence, but from the specific kind of tunnel vision that comes when fear starts making decisions. The attending who should have been managing the pediatric bay was 20 feet away arguing about a medication order. Patricia was still trying to sort triage. Nobody had a clear picture of the whole floor. In military terms, this is called a breakdown of command unity. When no one can see the whole battlefield, everyone fights their own small war, and the spaces between them fill with silence and catastrophe. Maya's blood pressure was dropping. Danny saw the number and felt her own blood go cold. She called for help. The call reached Patricia, who looked up from 2 other crises and said she'd send someone. The someone didn't come for 2 minutes. In the lobby, because this is the part nobody planned for, a man had arrived. Not from the bus. He was a family member of one of the crash victims, who had driven himself to the hospital in a panic and was now standing at the reception desk, confused and increasingly agitated, blocking the intake flow and slowing everything down by another 30 seconds per patient. Security was managing him. Or trying to. Ramirez was pulling double duty between the lobby and the floor and was on his radio and barely holding the seams together. The whole system was 30 seconds from something irreversible. And then, at 11:51 p.m., the ER doors opened. She hadn't been called. There had been no page. No one had her number anymore. She'd been scrubbed from the staff directory the same day the termination letter was processed. No one had thought to reach her, or thought she could help, or thought about her at all. Elena Marchetti had been at home. She had heard the sirens. She lived 12 minutes from Ridgerest. She had listened to the frequency of ambulance traffic the way some people follow storm patterns on weather apps, involuntarily, habitually, from years of it matching. She had counted the sirens. She had noted the timing. She had done the math. And she had gotten in her car. She walked in wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, without a badge, without an introduction, without asking for permission. She took 7 seconds to read the floor. 7 seconds. Then she moved. She went directly to Maya's bay. She put her hand on Danny's shoulder, one firm, grounding touch, and said 3 words, "I've got her." Danny, who was trembling and exhausted and out of options, stepped back. Some part of her that had nothing to do with protocol simply trusted the voice and the hands and the stillness. Elena worked. Fast, clean, precise. She identified the bleed. She stabilized the pressure. She called the correct orders, not asked, called, in the tone of someone who did not have to justify their authority and knew it. She directed the attending who finally arrived in a way that was less assistance and more managed handoff. She spoke to Dr. Park through the intercom in clear, concise language that cut through the noise and gave her exactly what she needed to manage the surgery from or to. While doing all of this, she flagged 2 other patients to Ramirez with a look and a gesture that needed no translation. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She just moved through the chaos like someone who had done this before, not in a hospital, but somewhere far more dangerous. By 12:08 a.m., Maya was stable. The floor had a shape again. The crisis had a center, and that center was holding. Gerald Holloway arrived at 12:11, having been called in. He stood at the door of the ER and looked at the floor, and then at the woman in civilian clothes standing in the middle of it, giving a handoff report to Dr. Park in the kind of clinical language that takes years of something to develop. And something moved across his face that was between recognition and dread. He didn't know her name yet, but he was about to find out everything. Because at 12:14 a.m., a sound reached them that none of them had ever heard in that parking lot before. The rhythmic, unmistakable percussion of a military helicopter. The helicopter settled into the hospital's helipad with the kind of authority that belongs to aircraft that don't ask for landing permission. They announce arrival and assume compliance. It was a Black Hawk. Military markings. No civilian livery. The rotors wound down and 2 figures stepped out onto the pad, both in uniform, both moving with the economic speed of people with somewhere important to be. One of them was carrying a sealed envelope. The other was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which later seemed to everyone who was paying attention like the strangest and most human detail of the entire night. They came through the staff entrance. Ramirez saw them first and went completely still. A career of reading authority just registered something off the scale. He stepped aside without being asked. They walked through the ER with the kind of purpose that parted people like water around a bow. Straight to Elena. No hesitation. No searching. They knew exactly where she was. They had always known where she was. The taller of the 2, a man with colonel's insignia and the face of someone who had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago, held out the envelope. Elena looked at it for a moment, then looked at him. Something passed between them that was not surprise and not relief, but something more complicated. The look between people who share a language the rest of the room doesn't speak. Colonel Harris. Captain Marchetti. You've been hard to reach. Elena. I wasn't hiding. Colonel Harris. No. You were just being very, very quiet. The room had stopped. Patricia Greer was standing at the nurse's station with her mouth open for the first time anyone could remember. Danny was still in Maya's bay, but had walked to the doorway and was watching with wet eyes and a kind of stunned reverence. Gerald Holloway was frozen at the entrance to the ER like a man whose understanding of something important was in the process of catastrophically revising itself. Elena took the envelope. Opened it. Read it. The second officer, quieter, watching the room with the professional peripheral awareness of someone who is always on duty, set one of the coffees on the edge of the nurse's station near Elena and kept the other. Nobody commented on this. Nobody moved. Elena folded the envelope, slid it into her jacket pocket, looked up at the colonel. Elena, I need 20 minutes. Colonel Harris, we have 30. She nodded, turned back to the floor, finished her handoff to Dr. Park, walked to Maya's bay, checked the chart one more time, said something quiet to Danny that made the younger nurse press her hand to her mouth and nod rapidly. Then she turned to Holloway, who had approached with the careful energy of a man who was trying very hard to look like he hadn't been blindsided. He began to speak. He got 3 words in before she held up one hand. Not rudely, just precisely, and he stopped. Here is what Elena Marchetti was, and what no one at Ridgerest had ever thought to look for. She had served 12 years in the United States Army. She had spent 7 of those years as a Special Operations Combat Medic, forward deployed, embedded with Tier 1 units in environments where the nearest surgeon was sometimes 400 miles and a satellite call away. She had managed combat trauma in conditions that would have destroyed most civilian trauma units. She had kept people alive with improvised equipment, bad light, worse weather, and the specific kind of resolve that can only be built in circumstances where resolve is the only thing standing between a person and a body bag. She had been decorated 3 times. The last decoration, the one referenced in the folded commendation letter in her bedside drawer, was for pulling 4 soldiers out of a burning vehicle under direct fire while managing a sucking chest wound on herself. She had refused evacuation until all 4 were stable. She had been unconscious for 14 hours afterward. She had left the Army 4 years ago. She had come home quiet and a little broken in ways that didn't show from the outside. And she had gone back to school and gotten her nursing credentials and taken the quietest job in the quietest hospital she could find because she needed, for a while, to be somewhere where nothing was on fire. She had been trying to disappear, and she had done it beautifully, until the night Ridgerest needed her more than it needed its own rules. The colonel, standing beside her in the middle of the ER, addressed the room, not loudly, but with the kind of voice that fills a space without effort. Colonel Harris, this woman spent 12 years keeping soldiers alive in conditions none of you will ever see. Whatever you thought she was, you were wrong. Whatever you thought she wasn't qualified to do, you were wrong about that too. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ridgerest Memorial had heard in years. Maya was stable, blood pressure holding. The ER team had taken over, and the prognosis was cautiously, carefully good. Elena had done what she came to do. She checked on 3 more patients in the minutes she had left, not because anyone asked, but because she was Elena Marchetti, and leaving a floor half-checked was not something